All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about China and the US-China trade war, which is a big topic these days. If you haven't met me online before, my name is Sean. I've lived and worked in China for the last 15 years, currently based in Shenzhen, which is the tech capital of China. If you have any issues with the video quality, with the sound quality, let me know. I've recently switched webcams. I'm using my DSLR camera right now, so just in case there's any issues, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to try and correct it. But hopefully, we should be okay. So, just a reminder: if you are interested in asking any specific questions, whether it be about the ongoing trade war, whether it be about the current ongoing discussion, the ban on Harvard students having international students, or just general questions about living and working in China, I'm happy to discuss those. To start off with, before we get into the trade war topics, let me give you a look at what the city landscape is like here in Shenzhen. I was just over at this new mall in the Shekou area, which is very nice. So let me take a look at this quick. So take a look. So this is more or less how green, how natural the design, the city landscaping is here in Shenzhen. So it's a very nice area, and I think that it's one of those images people need to look at if you really want to start understanding what China is really like. Again, not all cities are like that, but again, you can't say New York is supposed to be the same as a smaller town in the Midwest. Either way, one of the things I aim to do with my content online, whether it be LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, other platforms, I do try and focus not necessarily on making people like China or love China. It's everybody's own decision, of course, but it's very important to have an accurate, or at least a closer understanding to what China is really like, because one of the things I think we've seen with the trade war, no matter which side you're on, right, left, Republican, Democrat, is that one of the things that has brought on this trade war, which is going to negatively affect all U.S. consumers, all U.S. businesses, is that if we don't understand China, we can't really approach handling, managing the relationship in a way that can have a more or less positive effect for the USA. Because as an American, I do want the USA to thrive, but I think we have to do it in a smart way. So again, if there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. We're currently on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, or X if you prefer. If you are interested in following me, you can take a look at me on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, or Instagram, SeanUM_China, or you can find me via LinkedIn by my full name, Sean Upton-McLaughlin. So there, just in case you're interested in taking a look at that. So let's talk about the trade war, because I think that this has been a really big topic lately, and it's certainly been affecting the business I do over here. I talk to a lot of Chinese companies, and they're being affected, but we also see many U.S. businesses, U.S. small businesses being affected. So let's start off by talking about how important it is to understand. China is very important, not just to the global economy, to Western countries, to the USA. And one of the things that I've heard throughout my career in China is oh, well, China's lots of negative stuff. China's stealing our jobs. Well, technically, U.S. companies decided to ship those jobs over to China, and yeah, sure, maybe some workers lost out, but we also have U.S. consumers having a greater benefit in terms of being able to have lower cost products, not necessarily inferior products in terms of the quality, but because of China's economies of scale, their massive manufacturing infrastructure, they're able to then drive down the cost, which again means that we can buy it at a lower cost, which then also means that we can use our money that we don't spend on those products for other things. In addition to that, one of the things I remember, even on Fox News, I remember a month or two ago, they were talking about the story of one U.S. small business who their tariffs they were paying on the goods from China that they needed, they couldn't get anywhere else. It went from like 20,000, 30,000 USD in 1 year to maybe quadruple that. And I think that really is something that we can look at and say, well, listen, if we don't have manufacturing in China, let's say we can do it for the same quality in the USA. That's not necessarily the case because we may not have those manufacturing capabilities, or we may not be able to do it at scale. We certainly don't have the scale to, say, manufacture iPhones at the current global need in the USA. But that's something we can talk about later if you have any questions. So in addition to that, just US small businesses, how many of them are going to potentially be negatively affected if they cannot get products from China? And again, this is something that, whether or not you think we should be manufacturing so much in China, it is something that it's a reality. We have decided, or you could say the US government, US companies made the decision over the course of decades to push more and more of our manufacturing into China, and it's a net benefit as far as I'm concerned. Now, we can certainly talk about, should US, what do we do about the US workers who maybe have lost their jobs? Now, that's a very important issue, I think, but I think that it shouldn't fall to the US government saying, okay, now we have to get these jobs back, because we've made a choice in the USA overall to move away from low cost or mid-end manufacturing to a service economy, to the high tech. We have Silicon Valley. We're leading in AI, even though China is right behind us. So do we want to continue to move in that direction, or do we want to go back to where we were maybe several decades ago? And I personally would prefer us to keep moving forward. I think that China serves a very important role, though of course they are trying to grow out of that role. They don't just want to be the factory of the world anymore. They want to be a leader in innovation. And so when we think about what we want, how should our relationship with China be? I think we do need to think about, how we need them, basically. But at the same time, we also need to understand, do we want to be the manufacturer? Should they be the manufacturer? What do we want our children to be when they grow up? Do we want them to be working in factories, making Apple products? Or do we want them to be doing research, innovation? I mean, everybody can make their own decision, but here's a story I want to tell everybody. I was actually doing a very repetitive job when I was in college. I was actually painting all of the dormitories. And one of the things that I remember was it wasn't the worst, but it was very repetitive. I had a repetitive stress injury from that. That's still 20 years later, I still have that, but it's not the most fun thing. And so I personally think that we should not be focusing on manufacturing, but I won't tell you what you should or shouldn't believe. That being said, let's talk about another point, which is one of the things that I hear when I talk to the Chinese companies over here is I think what the US government expected when they instituted these tariffs is they expected China to concede, and they also maybe expected that the Chinese government would have to concede to a certain degree, because otherwise their companies would be maybe suffering financial harm. They would not have anywhere to sell their products. But when I've talked to Chinese companies over the past few months, their response isn't to say, oh no, what should we do? Or we have to wait and see if this is resolved. They are very, very quickly saying, okay, we're going to transfer to new markets. The USA is not a good place for investment right now. Now we need to move over to Europe. And this is at least 2 or 3 companies I've talked to who've had this response. And this is one of those things that people don't really understand about China in the West, unless they've been here and they've lived here for at least a few years, is China's speed. And they move very quickly. They're very flexibly, at least when it comes to sales, market expansion, R&D, product development. They're very, very fast. And they're faster than we are, and they're faster than we can be anywhere in the short term. So what that means is that the tariffs Um, Even if you think they're a good idea, even if you think we should have more manufactured in the USA, which that can be your opinion. I think that's fine. But I think what it comes down to is um, one of my main worries in terms of, say, allowing the USA to maintain its competitive edge. Because as an American, despite the fact that I like China and I've spent a lot of my career and life in China, I still want the USA to be competitive. I still want the USA to be one of the top economies in the world. And I think that there can be a beneficial relationship between China and the USA in terms of each pushing each other to improve. But that being said, if we are decreasing confidence in the US, say, with many different policies being enacted, contrary policies then being enacted, going back and forth, there's no clear path forward. It really seems to make the USA seem like not a very dependable or reliable place for investment. And uh, this is something that will affect everyone. It might affect the U.S. consumers if the less and less Chinese companies are willing to export as many products or to the USA. Maybe that means prices go up, or maybe that means the product availability goes down. U.S. businesses, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, they might have trouble getting the support they need, getting investment they need. And of course, if less Chinese companies are willing to invest in the USA, which I've definitely heard a few saying that, then that's also going to take away revenues from the US government, local US government. It's going to take away potential job opportunities from US workers. And so it's not simply a very simple scenario where we can institute tariffs and then suddenly have China give us what we want. I think we're seeing with what's happening with shipping, the logistics chain. I mean, we haven't even seen the full effect of prices going up just because of how long it takes for the logistics to sort themselves through. But from what I've heard, we should be seeing prices going up for a number of goods for U.S. consumers, and then it might be clear to many people about the type of impact we're looking at. Say, how many key goods are going to be going up by 30%. Something to consider. Now, again, if you have any questions, let me just double check because I'm not sure if I'm getting the comments from other platforms. Let me just take a look. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to link them down below. You can also send me a message later if you want. But one of the things I find is interesting, I see we have a number of people online, is that one of the things that Trump has talked about a lot is bringing manufacturing back to the USA. And I would be interested to hear, if anyone thinks that's a good idea, let me know why. Do you think we should be a manufacturing economy in the USA? Do you want to work, say, manufacturing iPhones? That's one of the examples Trump has talked about a lot. Or do you want your children to be working in factories? And again, if that's your opinion, that's fine. But I'd be interested to hear it because, from my own point of view, the way I was raised, I would prefer my own children to be in a better job than I was. But that being said, if you have any comments on that, feel free to let me know. Now, if you have any questions on that, we can come back to that. But let's talk about the current situation we're in. There's two things we can talk about. We have the 90-day tariffs going on right now, or the 90-day halt on the tariffs. And then we also have the Trump administration recently made comments about 50, I think it was 50%, what do you call it? 50%, was it 50% tariffs on smartphones? But it was aimed at Apple and then other smartphone manufacturers in terms of there's going to be a tariff on all smartphones, iPhones coming in the USA unless they started to be made in the USA. So that's an interesting point because we've made smartphones, iPhones in China and I think some in India. for years, and we don't have the capabilities to make iPhones in the USA. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the workers don't have the capabilities, or at least we don't have anywhere near the number of workers that are able to do that. And I think that hopefully can give people a better idea of we don't know. We don't have the skills to make iPhones. China does, but we don't. So there's a very big gap there. And if we do want to become a manufacturing economy, then yeah, sure. I think that's a direction the USA can choose to go in if it wants to, but we can't do it tomorrow. I mean, we would have to build factories. We would have to train talent. And assuming people want to be working in factories, but and also, I imagine no one wants to pay 3 times the amount they're currently paying for their smartphones. I certainly don't. So, yes, I'm an outlier because I buy my phones in China, but the point being is that if we decide to manufacture in the USA or manufacture outside China, all the prices are going to go up. And again, because China has the capabilities, they have the infrastructure, and we don't. Any questions, comments, feel free to shoot them in, no worries. If you have any ones you want to leave, I can also answer them after the chat, no problem. But let's move on. The 90-day halt on the tariffs. I think this was seen as a very big victory for the Trump administration. But, and I've talked about with a number of other people on LinkedIn about this, and I think the general consensus, at least among people who have worked in China for a long time, has been that the Chinese government has been rather reserved in its approach. They've been very diplomatic, they've been very polite, they haven't been very forthcoming with any specific opinions, except that they wanted the unilateral tariffs to go down. But I mean, we don't know what's going to happen over the 90 days for the halt of the tariffs. And for all we know, the Trump administration could raise them again. But either way, China is not really going to be backing down from what I've seen. I think it's an issue not simply of not willing to be bullied, which unfortunately has been a big part of their history. All the more reason for them not wanting to back down, especially because they didn't start it. And it's also not going to be winning any favors among the Chinese populace, Chinese businesses, because China sees very clearly that it's a key player in AI, it's a key player in robots and other manufacturing. And EVs is amazing. China makes, I think, some of the best EVs, but there's 100% tariffs on most Chinese EVs, not all, but most Chinese EVs, which is kind of silly because then overseas consumers don't get to enjoy those benefits from having better products technologically and also at a lower cost. So if you have any more questions on that, let me know. I want to, I think, move on to another topic. Because one of the things that really came to mind for me, because I'm sure many of you have been listening to the news, you've heard that the Trump administration, for reasons best known to them, have decided to ban or try to ban Harvard University from enrolling international students. And while this, at this specific time, is not focused on China, I think it's something that makes me think back to other measures that the US government has done, specifically aimed at China. I think it was a few years ago, it might have been during the Biden administration, but I remember very clearly there were a number of efforts to target not just Chinese businesses, but also Chinese scientists, Chinese students, Chinese business people. And it very much had the feeling of just, if you're from China, you're not welcome. Though, of course, with this Harvard ban or this ban on Harvard enrolling international students and various other anti-immigration measures that the U.S. has been looking at recently, unfortunately, it really is confusing to me. Though again, I may have a different perspective. I know I do, than people who haven't worked and lived overseas. But I'll break it down for a few things. One of the things that stands out to me is that even if you don't want illegal immigration to the USA, which is fine, yeah, people should immigrate legally to the USA. But I think that we often in the USA downplay how important immigrants are, not just to the USA, but to our leading edge in the world. So some basic facts, these are roundabout numbers. I haven't seen the very latest ones, but last I checked, Silicon Valley, 30% of the top talent in Silicon Valley was not US born. They were born in countries like China, India, and others. And so that's a big strength of the USA, is that we can, or at least previously, we were able to attract the best and the brightest to come to our country, whether it be to become US citizens, to work here as green card holders, and contribute to the US economy, which is great. And China's trying to do that too, though they don't exactly have the same culture of having non-Chinese, say, immigrants come over, though I think they've started to a certain degree, at least specific companies have. But and I think when I looked at it, I think that a larger percentage of these 30% of Silicon Valley tech workers were from India, but I believe a few years ago when I looked at it, it was 10 to 15% were from China. And so one of the things I've talked about with professional contacts is that, let's say US and China, we know US and China are in a dead heat in many areas, AI being one that's talked about a lot. But if we're in a dead heat, if we're neck and neck with China, but then we say, okay, we don't want any Chinese talent. Okay, now we're down 10% or 15% possibly. If we start cracking down on immigrants that are not Chinese, maybe that goes down further. How do we stay neck and neck with China if we cut off our own hand? If we take away 10 to 20% of the key talent that's been allowing us to stay ahead of China? What do you think? If you have any questions on that, feel free to let me know. But for me, someone who's lived and worked abroad for at least a third of my life, I think, it's a conundrum because it doesn't make sense. Immigrants, immigrant workers, immigrant innovation is such an important aspect of the USA, at least in certain fields, that if we're not willing to entertain that, I don't really see how the USA can remain competitive, at least in tech fields. But of course, if there's someone who knows more about tech fields, feel free to let me know. But that is the general feeling based on my experience here, based on people I've talked to. One other thing you may have seen in the news is that the NVIDIA CEO, Jensen Huang, who is Chinese. Now, when I say Chinese, I mean he is ethnically Chinese. I believe he is from Taiwan originally, but if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. And he made a comment recently because he flew over to Beijing to talk to the Chinese government, to meet companies and potential business partners. And he had kind of been more of a moderating voice, which is good, a moderating voice in terms of how we should engage with China, because when it comes down to it, according to him, and I think this is correct because I've looked online, he says 50% of the AI researchers are Chinese. That is a huge number because I'm pretty sure the other 50% are not all US born. A majority might be, and I'm sure some of that 50% of the Chinese AI researchers are working in the USA. So I think AI is a very key example here, because if we don't want Chinese talent, then where does our advantage go? So I think it's a very important aspect to think about in terms of the ongoing U.S.-China relationship, because politics, unfortunately, makes it very easy to paint China as a threat, as an enemy. And yes, they're a competitor. Yes, they're not necessarily, the most friendly to us on every single issue. There's lots of, tensions on a number of issues between the U.S. and China, between China and other countries, other Western countries. But just because there's tensions, just because there are issues we don't agree on, we can't forget how important they are to our own prosperity. I've talked before about how the U.S. consumers have a level of prosperity they would be unable to have without Chinese manufacturing. U.S. small businesses would not be able to have the same thing they had. They would not be able to operate at the same level without Chinese businesses. Another thing that I think is very relevant here is I previously did a video when they were initially talking about the TikTok ban, which is, I think it's still up in the air. I don't think it's 100% finalized. They may be on another grace period. But I remember talking about how at the time, I believe it was 5 million US small businesses relied on TikTok for their businesses, whether it be selling, whether it be promotion. And just one Chinese company, a big Chinese company, can have such an enormous impact on the US economy, on US small businesses, consumer prosperity. And I don't think that we really hear about that. All we hear about from the politicians are, oh, China's this, China's that, or China is hurting us, China is stealing our jobs. And if we continue to have that negative mindset, then we are going to, well, not going to, but as we've seen with the Trump administration, there's going to be actions taken thinking that, oh, China's the enemy. We take this approach, and we don't understand that we're shooting ourselves in our own foot, or cutting off our nose to spite the face, whichever saying you prefer. There is no measure we can take against China that will, or there are very few we can take that will not affect the U.S. economy, the U.S. consumers, the U.S. Businesses in some way. Oh, here's another great example that I actually previously talked about on LinkedIn. Now, you may have heard that Walmart was going to be increasing its prices on its products, which, well, of course they will. If there's big tariffs on all Chinese imports and they make many of their goods in China, of course they're going to be raising their prices. They probably have little option unless they want to sacrifice a lot of their profitability. But what previously happened a month or two ago, I forget how long, what happened actually was that the Chinese Walmart China, they actually started talking to their suppliers, which were already on super razor thin margins. And they were talking to them about, okay, well, we have this, it might have been 20% at the time. I forget exactly how much the early tariffs were on China. But they said, okay, we need you to eat this cost for us. And as soon as they started saying that, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce immediately got wind of it. They called them in to have a cup of tea, which is more or less meaning a governmental scolding. And the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, based on what I read, said, oh, no, you don't. You're not going to take these U.S. tariff efforts and then pass them on to your suppliers in China. And so, and if they had still tried to do it, they could have gotten in a lot of trouble in China. So that's probably why they eventually now decided to say they're going to raise prices on some of their goods in the U.S., even though the Trump administration is not very happy about it. But I'm not really sure what they can do. They're a business. They want to make money. They want to remain profitable. If the U.S. does a tariff on all goods from China and you rely on goods from China to sell in the USA, you're probably going to end up raising some of your prices. So I think anyone who understands economics would have seen that coming. But in any case, all right. So hello to Jonah, commenting from LinkedIn. And again, Jonah, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. What we've talked about already, we've talked about some of the aspects of the U.S.-China trade war, such as the USA underestimating how much it needs China, how China enables U.S. consumer prosperity, small business prosperity, the 9-day ban on tariffs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But currently we're talking about innovation and how important immigrants are to innovation. So let me get back on track. Oh, and just in case anybody missed it, let's just take a look at this very cool scene here in Shenzhen, China. This is in Shekou, and this is one of the new malls by the seaside. This is one of the things I love the most about living in Shenzhen specifically, is that they built the city from the ground up in the last few decades, and that's allowed them to have a huge amount of green spaces. We're right by the seaside, so there's so many walking paths that allow you to just go all along the entire seaside for 20 kilometers or so. So it's very nice, and I hope everybody can start thinking about China with a new frame of reference, being that many of the cities, whether it be first tier or second tier, they are very modern, they're very clean in terms of crime, they're very safe. And it's really a really great place to live, especially when we have things like the app economy, cashless payments. I often stop by 7-Eleven and I literally just pay with my palm. So don't take a picture of my palm because you might be able to steal my information. I'm joking, but it's really great. It's really line of the future, and it's not something that's oh, all right. We got a tariff chart. Hold on, I'm not sure. Let me see if I can bring that up quickly. So hold on, everyone. I'm going to see if I can access that chart, because I'd be interested to see. So first, let me get rid of this media. All right. All right, let me just open this quick. And again, if anybody has any comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. This is always more fun if you can ask your specific questions about China, whether it be the trade war, whether it be working in China, living in China. I'm always happy to share. So let me just open this up quickly. Thanks again to Jonah for sharing. Let's see what it is. Oh yeah, so February 1st, it was first 10% on all goods, then it was 20% as of March 3rd, then it went up to 54, then 104. Yeah, it's really started going up a lot in April, I see. So thanks for sharing that. I'll probably, if it's okay with you, I'll probably share it on LinkedIn later. But it's definitely very useful. Nice summary of how the tariffs have evolved. All right, so no, I think that's just so interesting, because I was just mentioning how the comment from NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang about 50%, half of the entire world's AI researchers are from China. Let that sink in, because anytime anyone thinks, oh, China is just a low-cost manufacturing, they should be reminded very quickly, 50% of AI researchers are Chinese. That really, I think, is just something that can really quickly wake us up about how advanced China is. Yeah, sure, there are definitely low-cost manufacturing in China. There's all kinds of manufacturing in China. There's places that still make really low-cost gifts, but there's places that make high-end robots. They make EVs. They make chairs. They make desks. They make lots of stuff. And to be honest, the quality is going to depend on how much the buyer, the overseas buyer, is going to want to charge for it. If they say, "Oh, we want to sell it for less," then the Chinese factory is not going to make as good of a product. So it's not that Chinese factories or Chinese businesses make bad quality products, but if they want to make a profit, they're very practical about money. So if Chinese companies are producing a quote unquote cheap good for US businesses, my first question would be, why are they making it cheap? Is it because they're choosing to, or is it because they're working within the budget that's been given to them by the Western or the overseas buyer? Key question to ask. Not all Chinese companies are perfect. I'm sure some will maybe try and cut corners. I mean, there's 1.4 billion people at least. So there's good and bad everywhere, but we should not underestimate how advanced certain sectors in China are. I mean, again, 50% of AI researchers, it feels insane. And with that in the backdrop, not just China's progress in AI, but on robots, on EVs. I mean, they make better EVs than we do in the West, I would say. I mean, at least that's what it feels like when I visit the Huawei stores and other EV stores. But we still call China this low-cost, cheap, bad quality manufacturer. So one of the ways I describe it is that China is here, but our consciousness regarding China is down here. We're stuck in the 80s or 90s in terms of how we view China. Now, again, why should you care if you're viewing China incorrectly? That's another point we can talk about. Let's say you're okay. So what was I just going to say? Okay, so good comment from Jonah. Let me finish my current thought, and I will answer that. So, right. So why should you care about misjudging China? So first of all, if you're a regular, let's you're a voter. China is often the scapegoat in U.S. politics. China is often blamed. China is often painted as a very scary figure. So if you're going to vote, you might be scared of China, and then you may vote for anti-China measures, which, as we've seen now with the tariffs, are actually directly hurting U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses. That's simply how it is. So if you don't understand China, you can be misled, whether it be on social media, whether it be in the polls, and you might be negatively affected. Another thing, as a student, I mean, right now, China is somewhat isolated. You don't see that many Chinese talent coming over to work directly competing with, Western talent, but it does happen, and it may happen more in the future. Or if China gains more of the high-tech fields and they can't stop them with tariffs, there may be more Chinese companies working in overseas markets, and that might be a key source for jobs. And so, if you don't understand China, you don't know how to work with Chinese companies, you may not be able to get the best jobs. If you're a business, you don't understand China, you don't understand how Chinese businesses operate, how quick they are, how innovative they are, it could be very easy for you to be surpassed. I mean, look what happened for ChatGPT, one of the top, if not the top AI companies in the world, where suddenly DeepSeek had something that was able to compete with them. Whether or not you think it was as good, whether or not you think they copied or did a +1 version of whatever ChatGPT was doing, I think is irrelevant, is that was very quick. They came out of nowhere, at least from the US consciousness. So if you don't understand China's speed and how quickly Chinese companies move, you could be out of business. So it's very important. If you don't like China, that's fine. But if you don't understand China, it can really come back to bite you in the butt. So let's see. So, question from Jonah. Let's take a look. In China's intensely competitive economy, do zombie firms exist? Businesses with no prospects but borrowed money, living like a zombie. Yeah, this is not an area where I'm particularly knowledgeable about, but there certainly might be companies that are not making very much money and then trying to, get by without paying taxes or without. I think really what it comes down to is that unless they have a backer, I'm not sure how they're going to keep going. Now, burning monies. There's plenty of companies that want to start up, that want to try and become a leader or try and become a key player in the industry. And yeah, they might be burning money. They might be trying to innovate. They might be doing R&D, but it might amount to nothing. But again, I can't really say I'm an expert on zombie companies. But here's another example that might shed some light on that specific thing, is that one of the things we talk about when it comes to China speed is how quick and agile Chinese companies are domestically. And this is one reason why you might see Chinese companies who go overseas. Maybe they aren't 100% compliant. Maybe their products aren't 100% perfect. It's because the way things operate domestically in China is that you have that pressure to be quick. You're either quick or you die. It's that simple, because there's so many there's so much saturation. There's so many companies, operating against each other, and so whoever's the quickest more or less wins. And so there's definitely going to be plenty of companies that burn themselves out, and they just can't cut it. But whether or not that's a zombie company, I'm not sure. All right, another question. And again, if you have any questions, whether you're on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, feel free to drop any comments in. If not, you can always send me a message or a comment after the chat is over. No problem. We're here to talk about China. If you'd like to listen only, that's fine. If you'd like to join the conversation, feel free. So, how China fosters innovation and small, medium enterprise growth. So, one of the things that I think is very important, this is something I've been hearing in the news in the backdrop of the trade war, is that China has put a lot of or the government has put a lot of effort into education and training in terms of the workforce, whether it be on the manufacturing side, whether it be on the high tech side. And I think this is one reason why. And I think, was it China? It might have been China, where they were going to have. Let me see if I can find something on this quick. Let's see. All right. But this is something I've talked about at least before, in terms of their willingness to build up their infrastructure. And I think you can call talent type of infrastructure, though, of course, one of the things I've talked about a lot has been, say, the high-speed rail network, or these new high-tech cities that they have. But education, I think, is another aspect, the infrastructure of a nation. And I just say that from my own perspective. I'm not quoting anyone. Let's see. Yeah, I don't see anything in the news right off the top of my head, so it must have been somewhere else that I saw it. But I think the Chinese government, they very clearly understand that if they want to be competitive, if they want to be able to help shape the future, they need to have the right talent. And they have many upcoming industries. They have tech, they have semiconductors, chips, artificial intelligence, and you can only get that talent which then gives you and your company's advantage if you put in the effort to educate that talent. And so they're putting in, I think, much more effort to educate people, whether it be from lower age ranges to high school to college, postgraduate. And I think that that's one key thing that the Chinese government, I should say, is doing. That, again, I know the U.S. government has its own measures, but I really feel like the Chinese government just takes the education, setting the foundation a lot more seriously. Okay, hold on. All right, so we got a good news article. So you found it when I couldn't. Let's take a look quick. So let's take a look at this. So thanks again, Jonah, for sharing. Maybe I'll ask you to have a joint webinar sometime. But let's see. So where is it? So we're going to share the screen. That should be it. So this is what was shared, and so it says China steps in with vocational school overhaul and 11 key tasks to help boost self-sufficiency and tech prowess. And I think that's just one example, but China, in my experience at least, has had a much more humble attitude when it comes to how they view themselves compared to the USA, compared to other countries. It really reminds me of Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's founder and CEO. And again, I previously worked for Huawei for about 4.5 years. But he would always tell the executives, the researchers, the managers, study from the USA. And it didn't matter how much the USA or the US government was attacking Huawei or trying to prevent them from expanding into other countries. He would always say, you need to focus on learning from the USA. There's always things that you can learn from the USA. And in this case, I think the Chinese government is always looking for ways it can improve, whether it's how it's trained its talent, what it needs to do to increase its own, and it's not just its own tech prowess. It's not just about competing with the USA. It's also about self-sufficiency, which is what this article, I'll show you again, what the article says is the boost self-sufficiency and tech prowess. Because one of the things that we saw, with the ban on, say, Huawei phones being able to use Google, as well as I think there was a ban on chips being imported to China from the USA, is that the USA not only viewed China as a competitor and was trying to compete with them, but they were also trying to block them, say you can't get these chips, or you can't, you can't use our app store. A number of measures trying to break Chinese companies or Chinese innovation efforts, or at least their ability to compete abroad, which I think is the wrong approach. I think that it would have been better to allow Huawei to sell their smartphones in the USA, for other companies to compete unobstructed in the USA, because what happens when you're selling Chinese EVs in the USA against US EVs? I think the Chinese ones are going to be better. And even if you don't let them sell them with no tariffs, I think you can at least let them sell them at a competitive price and let the consumers decide. I certainly think Huawei phones were better, at least when they were banned, than Apple and Samsung in many ways. And without Huawei in the market, there's no pressure for Apple and Samsung to innovate more, move faster, which again is a harm to the consumer. So China is working to increase its innovation as opposed to letting its innovation stagnate, whether or not specific companies or industries have the opportunity to move to the USA. So let's see. So um, any comments on that? I'd be happy to have any comments, whether it be on our talk on the U.S.-China trade war, on the U.S. I don't want to say dependence on immigrants, but the importance of high-tech innovation and immigrants on the U.S. economy overall. And then, of course, if there's any questions on living and working in China, happy to take any questions on that. Though, again, you're more than welcome to send me a message on LinkedIn, send me a message on Twitter if you're interested in talking more about a specific topic. It's always fine. Let's see. Yeah, so for now, it's been about 15 minutes so far. So I think for now, all right, hold on. What's this? Oh yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jonah. There's always some ban on Huawei. Um, Maybe I should do another episode about the most common misconceptions about Huawei and Chinese tech companies, but I don't think there's enough time today. So I'll leave, if there's any more specific questions on the U.S.-China trade war, if there's any more specific questions on the intended U.S. ban on international students, at least for Harvard, feel free to let me know. Let me double check the other platforms. I'm not sure if people can directly comment on Twitter, but they can on YouTube. So again, any questions, comments, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, in a few minutes, I might end the stream for today. If you have any other topics you're interested in hearing a stream about or a discussion, feel free to let me know. And I may try doing a short stream every Saturday from now on, but I may also experiment with different times during the week. Though I think at this time, it's 10 a.m. in the morning when I start, it's fairly good for both China and the USA. But I may also try one that's a little bit later at night because I do talk to a lot of people that are based in Europe, but we'll see. Thanks again to Jonah for the questions. Uh, I may do a follow-up with you on some of these issues because you've definitely shared a lot, so I appreciate that. But I think in closing, what I'll say is that it's vital to understand China. You don't have to agree with China, you don't have to like China, but if you're in the USA or even a Western country, China, its companies probably have a very huge impact on you and your life, even if you don't see it directly. And that's what we're seeing in the USA. Consumer prices are going to go up, which is going to be very hard for many consumers, especially the ones that are living day to day, month to month, week to week. I have no idea how many US businesses might have to close down simply because they can no longer afford to get the product from China that they can't get anywhere else. And so going to be some hard days ahead, I think, unless something happens and the Trump administration decides to drop all or most of the tariffs. But we'll see. I don't really feel the impact because I'm based in China, but I do have family back in the USA. So I do hope that we can resolve this quickly and focus on competing directly and not trying to use underhanded methods such as tariffs, bans. Now, again, tariffs, yes, you can use them in certain situations, but I mean, just trying to use them the way the Trump administration, I don't think that's very positive. I don't think it's going to force the Chinese government to give way, and it's just going to harm consumers and small businesses. In any case, thanks for joining today's stream. If you would like to follow me on, you can take a look at the top. I'm Sean UM_China on Twitter, or X if you prefer, YouTube, Instagram, as well as TikTok. While it's still up, who knows how long that will be for. If you would like to talk business or follow me on LinkedIn, you can just find me via my full name, Sean Upton-McLaughlin, or just follow the link that I think I've left. I'll leave it on the closing as well. China going global. So remember, China's rising power, and no matter how many tariffs, no matter how many bans the U.S. institutes, they're not going to be stopped. They're going to be self-sufficient, and they're going to have a very big impact on the world. So, how we live side by side with China is partly in our hands as consumers, as voters in the USA. But just reflect, I would say, on how much more difficult your life or your business would be without China. Think about it. And thanks for joining today's stream. If you're interested, you can follow me or subscribe on my various social media channels, and hopefully we'll have another one in either a week or maybe half a week. I'll have to see what the dates are. But if you subscribe, you should get notifications, and have a good weekend. And thanks for tuning in.